Good evening. My name is Maya Abarusk. I'm a sophomore at Southeast High School and a member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the tribes that once called Lincoln home. They include the Omaha, Ponca, Oda Missouri, Kansa, and Pawnee peoples. Native peoples of many nations live in Lincoln today and contribute to our community's vitality and diversity. And I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. I think it's important to remember our history. And in fact, it's history that I want to speak to you about tonight. As a lifelong student of Lincoln Public Schools, I am disappointed in the lack of education of Native American history. I actually learned from my parents about the fact that Christopher Columbus didn't actually discover America, and that many millions of indigenous people were here long before the Spanish explorers' misguided attempts to reach India. I never learned these facts in my classes on Lincoln Public Schools. The latest attack on critical race theory concerns me, and it makes me worry about the kind of education my siblings are going to receive in the future here at LPS. I don't believe the school district addresses history critically or honestly. In a recent blog post, LPS Superintendent Steve Joel addressed the controversy over critical race theory, saying the district has not adopted curriculum that centers on the teaching of critical race theory, though he did emphasize the district's efforts to improve equity by seeking to better understand people's personal biases and the systemic biases that exist within our schools. But how can you do that if you aren't educating students about this nation's true history? Whether you call it critical race theory or just plain history, which it is, you must do better at educating the future generations about the origins of systemic bias in our nation. For example, why didn't I learn during all the rosy lessons about Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of America that he and his men nearly wiped out the entire Taino population of Hispaniola within 2 years of landing there? I had to learn from my father about the Pope's decree in 1493, granting Spanish explorers the right to murder and enslave any non-Christians who lived in America in order to take their lands. A decree that was used to justify the genocide of Native people and the enslavement of Africans in America. And I had to learn from him about the real history of Christopher Columbus, who once wrote of the Arawak people of the Caribbean islands, quote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want," unquote. The sad thing about all of this discussion regarding critical race theory is that LPS curriculum is already so whitewashed that it would be nearly impossible to make that curriculum any less critical of racial history in America. Practically the only thing left to erase would be the handful of lessons we receive on slavery and Martin Luther King Jr. So why are we even having this discussion? I see it as a clever and rather sinister ploy by conservatives to try to further erase the foundations of the social justice movement in America. And I am hopeful that all of you are intelligent enough to see that as well. Finally, I would urge all of you to get on the right side of history and take a stand against this ridiculous attack on truth. Wopila Tonka, thank you.
Thank you. And Kevin, you are next.
I really like her. I don't know about you, but good evening. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. My name is Kevin Abarusk, and I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. I'm a longtime journalist and the father of 4 LPS students and 1 very recent graduate of Lincoln Southeast. Tonight I want to talk to you about history. Much like my daughter, I too am disappointed in having to speak before you tonight in defense of history. This latest attack on critical race theory, a type of curriculum that isn't even being taught in Lincoln Public Schools, reminds me of the controversy over sex education in the 1960s and 1970s, when again conservative Republicans took to the education boardrooms of America to bemoan a largely invented crisis. That crisis involved teachers educating their children about sexual intercourse and encouraging homosexuality, something few, if any, teachers were teaching their students at the time. Fears of sex education causing children to become more susceptible to Marxism and other immoral philosophies that were voiced then are eerily similar to the fears being expressed by conservative parents today. For those parents, critical race theory is an attack on the very moral fabric of democracy, of capitalism, of America itself. To teach children history that is critical of this country's founding fathers must inevitably lead to students questioning their parents, hating each other, and experiencing self-shame. But is this the real truth behind this attack on critical race theory? According to Superintendent Steve Joel, LPS has not adopted any curriculum that centers on the teaching of critical race theory. In a blog post addressing this topic, Dr. Joel said LPS's work to understand personal biases and systemic biases that exist within the district in order to further the district's goal of equity for all students. However, the district works to do that without shaming or blaming anyone for what has occurred in the past, he said. I want to thank you, Dr. Joel, for your courage in addressing systemic bias in our schools. But I also want to urge all of you to stand by your ideals and disregard this assault on what is an entirely fabricated problem, one designed primarily to stoke fears of white children being shamed for the sins of their grandparents. You know, in all honesty, I'd love it if these parents were addressing a real problem. I'd be proud to stand here tonight and voice support for the teaching of critical race theory in our schools. And I'd be honored, truly honored, to fight for the right of teachers to enlighten their students about this country's true history, however bleak and uncomfortable that might be. And while I don't like the idea of white children being made to feel uncomfortable, I can tell you that my own children feel uncomfortable every single day they show up to schools that fail to acknowledge their very existence or their people's contributions to history. Schools that fail to teach them what they are already beginning to suspect is the truth, that disastrous historical events like the native boarding schools and smallpox epidemics among early indigenous communities weren't simply the result of a few bad actors, but were in fact perfectly executed social engineering experiments. And that similar experiments, such as the redlining of minority neighborhoods and these very efforts to crush the teaching of systemic bias in our schools, continue today. You know, a much wiser man than me once said, "Nothing changes unless someone is made to feel uncomfortable." I fear that by focusing so much on trying to spare our children the uncomfortable truths of history, that we doom them to remain trapped by its worst manifestations. And I fear that my own children's children will have to attend schools that continue to ignore their people's place in history or their accomplishments. And so I'd urge you to simply ignore these artificial concerns being raised about critical race theory and take the first steps toward true equity by educating our children the sometimes uncomfortable truths about this country's past. Finally, I just want to say a few words about masks. You know, we live in one of the greatest countries in the world. We elect our friends and our neighbors to make decisions that they feel are right for us. And last year, for the most part, you did it right. And I trust you once again to make the right decisions in this coming year. And I want to thank you again for giving me this chance to speak tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Annette Lucci.